Well, thank you all for coming. The icebreaker for today was, what was your favorite childhood place? Thought I'd start out by showing you my favorite childhood place. I'm from Greensboro, North Carolina. I grew up there, and I was one of many children, grew up in a small house, and I learned early to spend a lot of my time outdoors. And this is where I spent a lot of my time. It's a little creek in Greensboro, not too far from my house. And it's my favorite childhood place. It's where I learned about when the water flowed and where the birds built their nests and how to find crawfish, how to build boats, how to build swings over the creeks and bridges. And I would frankly say that most of what I know as an architect now, I learned there by the time I was 8 years old. My friend Kevin Carl, who's a child psychologist, tells me that each of us has a childhood place, a little half acre that's imprinted in our memory and we carry all our lives. So here I am as a young person. I made huge collections of wild things, birds' nests and shells and turtles. And very early on, I learned that I could draw. And I've been a lifelong drawer. I've always had a sketchbook in my pocket. I grew up in, parts of North Carolina that at that time were quite rural. And I would see buildings like this and they meant nothing to me. Now, of course, they mean a great deal to me. This is a North Carolina tobacco barn, for those of you who don't know. It's 24 feet square and 24 feet high. Tobaccos used to be cured in it every fall. Every one of them is the same, but every one of them is different because the farmer who built this knew which way the winds were coming from. And you can look at this barn and you can tell which direction is north. In fact, I don't think my pointer works, but there's a little door on the upper side and that faces south because the bad winds are going to come from the north. And he built the porch on the southwest side because that's where he'd get shade and a cool breeze when his folks were working on the tobacco. Of course, this was all lost on me. This is where I studied architecture. Having grown up in Greensboro, I thought I would try out going to England for a year. I'd heard about this great school. I stayed for 9 years. It's in that little circle on the map is in the center of London. I adored living in London. I mean, for a kid who grew up in Greensboro playing in creeks to be able to live in London, it was a treasure. And that's the school I went to, which was it was a house built in 1690. These are the things that we studied. At that time, modern architecture meant everything. And so when I was 21 years old, I went to see Le Corbusier's Villa Savoye. At that time, it was in ruins. But like most people of my generation, modernism and the principles of modernism and even the ideals, these are the things that we followed. So when I moved back to North Carolina 30 years ago, this is the sort of building I did. This is the first independent house I designed. It's on the Bogue Banks near Morehead City. My client was a marine biologist. He, wanted a place where he could go with his 6 children and spend the summers. So I designed this house and, I was just longing to make a Le Corbusier type house on the coast of North Carolina. I knew this would be a first. And so I said, I'll build it of concrete. Well, it didn't take me long to find out you can't build a house of concrete in North Carolina. It's too expensive. Well, then I'll build it of steel, I said. That's a modern material. And then I learned that, building with steel at the coast is a really bad idea because of salt spray. And so I found wood. And I'd been making things of wood since I was a child, and I suddenly realized here was this knowledge I already had. I didn't have to learn it from a European architect. And so I took great joy putting 2x4s and 2x8s together to make this house, which is, now it's over 20 years old, and it's survived many hurricanes, and I felt that was, that was my first building here. So about this time, I started to notice that North Carolina had so much variety in terms of its people and its ecology and its trees and its plants. And so, as I was traveling around, my wife was driving, I would make these little sketches of things I saw in the mountains or at the coast. And I discovered this map which showed that North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia have these very distinct ecological zones, quite different, that vary from almost tropical at the coast around Wilmington or Charleston where palm trees grow, to almost Canada up in Mitchell County where Mount Mitchell is. So there's great variety. We also have some of the greatest botanical variety in the country. Up there in the mountains, the little dot up at the upper left, that's up in Mitchell County. And in that county, there is the highest diversity, the greatest number of botanical plants, mosses, algae, anywhere in North America. It's the richest biological environment. It's because the glaciers didn't come there. Most of North America was under a glacier 10 or 20,000 years ago, but they didn't come here. Whereas on the other hand, in the plains of North Carolina, the soils are so poor that the plant life is relatively sparse. And there's this little plant, which is very special because it's a North Carolina plant, the Venus Flytrap. You might have had one when you were a child. It lives on soils that are so poor it has to catch its own nitrogen. So it has to fertilize itself because it's not going to find it in the soil. So I thought, well, how wonderful is it that North Carolina has this great variety of plants and animals, but you can find the same little gray and white spec builder's house in Mandio and Asheville. The architecture was not responding to that. We had this great variety, but our architecture was pretty plain vanilla. About this time, I started to discover that, in fact, there was an architecture in North Carolina that paid great attention to where it was built, and that's, of course, because it was built by farmers. A friend of mine says that, local or vernacular architecture, that's to say architecture that's made without architects, that's what you do when you can't afford to get it wrong. So if you were a small farmer and you were growing your tobacco, the lives of your children depended on it. And so you built a barn that served that function. So, for example, the barn on the left is the sort of barn that people build in the mountains to cure tobacco because it's dry and not humid up there. The barns on the right are the ones built in eastern North Carolina because it is humid and the tobacco has to be flue cured. And you can study what the farmer was thinking when he built those porches on, and they're built according to the seasons. So I found this very inspiring, and it started to make me think, well, what if I could think about architecture in the same way that a farmer did? So I've thought about that, and I've written about it. I think there is, we have, the theme of today is heritage. Well, we have all about us this heritage. I know lots of times we think that North Carolina doesn't have much history. It has a great deal of history. I was at a conference in Cambridge earlier this week, and folks there were talking about, well, what is this regional architecture anyway? Because most regions, their history is not very old. And there's not a lot, how would you say you could do a regional house in South Carolina? But my response was, well, if you just look at the barns, you'll find things that have been embedded in their regions because they had to for hundreds of years. Not that what I designed looks like a barn. I mean, I'm not saying you copy a barn, right? I've never done anything that really looks like a barn. This is a house that my wife and I built for our family in Raleigh. It's in a university neighborhood, which is very busy at any time of the day, and at any time of the 1 in the morning, you'll find folks wandering around, dropping beer cans on the streets and singing. And so But we wanted to be here because it's a block away from NC State, where I taught and where she was a student in horticulture. And so we, as you can see, this is the street. A feature of our street is pickup trucks parked during the day, a lot of trash cans, and a lot of activity at night. So we wanted to create an oasis, and this is what we did. We created a walled garden. It's a small house. It's 1,800 square feet. It's not as big as the space we're sitting in, but we put this pool in, and that was one of the best things that we did, was to give it this body of water, which is like a diary of the day. And although it's a very modern-looking house, Judy grew up in San Antonio and loved Mexico, and we traveled there many times, among other things, to see the work of the great Mexican architect Luis Barragan. And you can sense there's some influence of his work in our house. You know, I'm very interested in things that belong to their place, but that doesn't prevent me from looking at other places. I mean, in fact, it empowers you to look at other places and if necessary, take ideas from them, because you're going to be sharing your ideas. So even though it's a very modern-looking house, it actually has a very traditional plan. It's a center hall with rooms on either side. We pushed it back to this end of the lot so that Judy would have the biggest garden, and we planted it under these trees. Well, you know, when we set out to design this house, I was the architect, and I knew, you know, where the house should go. This is our lot. It's 90 feet wide and 140 feet long. I knew the house should go here, so I designed the house here. Well, Judy not so gently pointed out that that house would be facing west and would burn up in the afternoon, and there was no place to park, and this was a student neighborhood. Why don't you put the house here, she said. I said, impossible, you can't put the house there. It's under these 75-year-old oak trees. And she said, yes, but if we put the house there, the trees will shade the house, and it'll give me the biggest garden, and the house will face north, so you can have lots of windows on that side. I said, well, it'll kill the trees. She said, well, I know this man, Professor Bilderbeck at NC State, and he knows about building houses under trees. So we went to see Ted, and he said, sure, you can do that. You just put the house on little piers. So to this day, the roots of this tree are actually out here under the lawn. They go under our house, right? So what did I learn from this? Always listen to a landscape architect. Here's another sketch. I've been fascinated by these houses since I was a child. They're at Nag's Head. Some of you may know them. They're locally called the unpainted aristocracy. They're these gorgeous houses made of shingles with no air conditioning, no paint. They've been sitting there, some of them since 1854. And they faced innumerable hurricanes. Some of them have been moved back from the beach 3 or 4 times because the sea level is rising. So these too can be an inspiration. My brother asked me to design a house for him. Only those of you who've ever been asked by your brother to design something can know the meaning of that. My brother asked me to design a house for him, my younger brother, and that little sketch at the top shows the primary view from his house, which was to the west, to a sunset. He's in Charleston, Mount Pleasant. He wanted windows 12 feet high. He watches birds. He wanted them to face west out over a salt marsh. So by now I had learned not to say no to when clients, have a really special request. So here's the design of the house. It has this window 12 feet high. It faces west so he can see those sunsets and the birds, but it's got this ingenious device that's going to shade the windows. You can't see that one at all. It has these folding screens that are up most of the time but come down in summer. You can still see through them, but they shade the house and you're not burned up by the western sun. And Joe's previous house had been destroyed in Hurricane Hugo. So he didn't want to have to worry about that anymore. So I developed this little device that could close down and shelter the building. couldn't have done it without Christian Karkow, who's an artist here in Raleigh, and he had just graduated from NC State, one of my best students. And he took on the challenge of making this and made it here in Raleigh and took it down there on the back of his pickup truck, and it's now survived 3 hurricanes. So it's another example of learning from our place by responding to it in an innovative way. And many people have said, you know, it kind of reminds them of traditional buildings in Charleston. That's not where I started, but I find it satisfying that it's a, 21st century solution to a 18th century problem about shade and shelter. I made this little sketch and wrote this piece in Native Places about the time Hurricane Sandy was sweeping through Staten Island and Red Hook, where my daughter lives. It was devastating. People in New York, they thought they were immune from nature, and a hurricane would never come, but of course it did. Well, these folks here, this is again on the Bogue Banks, they've been building houses for over 200 years that have survived all these hurricanes, and they do it because they pay attention to their place. They don't build on the seafront, they build behind the dunes. They don't build out in the open, they build underneath these sheltering live oak trees. This is a house I designed some years ago for Jim and Janice Taylor. They lived in Raleigh, they wanted a house in the Bahamas. This is the section of a typical house in the Bahamas. You collect all the rainwater from the roof. You can't have wells in the Bahamas. You collect that rainwater. The whole lower floor is like a swimming pool. That's where you keep the water. You live on the upper floor because you get a good breeze there, and you stay away from the mosquitoes, which tend to hover on the ground. Well, for the Taylors, I took that idea and I said, well, since the roof is going to collect all the water, why not turn it into a funnel? Take the water through the center of the house, store it down here, put the living spaces on the 3rd floor and the bedroom spaces on the middle floor, and it was a big success. I designed the house so it faced due north-south. As you know, the sun sets exactly in the west on March 21st. So here it is, March 21st, it's setting exactly in the west. I love that. Somebody's passed out over here and is missing that, but. So here are little sketches of the house, and this is what it looked like. Right after this house was built, the Taylors had assured me that this island was rarely visited by bad weather, but right after this house was built, it got its greatest test. I was in New Orleans a couple of years ago, and a friend of mine said, well, you have to go and see Oak Alley. It's a plantation on the Mississippi River. And he said, you have to go see it because the shadows are fantastic. And so I went there, and sure enough, the shadows from these oak trees, which are 300 years old, are truly phenomenal. By the way, more people get married here in Louisiana, it seems, than almost anywhere. It's now a wedding venue. This plantation house is very romantic. So when we were there was one wedding going on inside, another wedding was having its reception under the oak trees, and the third wedding was lining up on the far side, Anyway, so I love the idea of shadows. And my wife volunteered me to do a project for the J.C. Ralston Arboretum. If you don't know the J.C. Ralston, this is a national treasure. But they had this old lath house, L-A-T-H, lath house. Sometimes when I say that, people think I'm saying a laugh house, but it's a lath house. And it's really to provide shadow. So here's a little photograph I made of it in place. And it's actually got an ideal of mine that certain buildings just melt or evaporate. You hardly know they're there. They have such a light touch. And I love this building because it did that. It's made very simply out of 2x2s and 2x6s, put together in a few weeks. It's now sheltering plants, and it will for a long time to come. Here's another sketch I made for Native Places. This is a house that belonged to the 5th president. It's up in Virginia. James Monroe lived in this house, and it's a little cabin. It's a very modest cabin. It's been a long time since we had a president who grew up in a modest cabin. But what I liked about this building was that it was very simple. It had a porch that faced south. It was shaded by trees, and it was made with local materials. You could also open that door and the wind would blow right through it. It seemed very natural to its place. Well, today we call all those things sustainability. To James Monroe, they just made sense. He was a farmer, you know. So when we designed the new headquarters for the AIA, this was a competition, I wanted it to have those same qualities. I worked with a landscape architect from Virginia, Greg Bleem, and the first question he asked when we sat down to think about the competition was, what materials do you want to make it of? Not what are we going to do about the parking or, you know, where's the storm drain? What materials do you want to make it of? And I intuitively just said, well, we'll make it of stone and concrete and tin. Because I knew those were North Carolina materials, and I wanted this building, which represents all the architects in North Carolina and the qualities of good design, to seem like it belonged to North Carolina. So this was the sketch that won the competition. This is a view of it. It's over there on P Street. It's embedded in the landscape like James Monroe's house. It uses local materials like his house did. The wood is from the Great Cypress Swamp. The stone is from 3 different quarries. We collect all of our rainwater and keep it there on the side. It's a very sustainable building, but best of all, I feel like it has a sense of belonging here. This is one of my favorite photographs. Someone took it and sent it to us. The building on the right is the state of North Carolina. You know, we're an energy efficient state. We look after our energy. Well, here we are at midnight and all the lights are on. And over there is our little AIA building at midnight and no lights are on. In fact, the lights don't come on until you come in and move around. So, to sum up, why do I think it's so important to pay attention to the place where you are? Because we live in this world that's becoming totally placeless. And there are many good things about that. I adore my iPhone. I love being able to drive my car, you know, and all the benefits of being in the 21st century. But I think there is a real threat that we become increasingly disembodied from our place, and when we become disembodied from our place, we don't respect it. So that's why I love every square inch of our house and garden. And I just contrast it with this photograph of Las Vegas. Those of you who've been know that when you go to Las Vegas, you can visit Venice. There's the Campanile of St. Mark's. A little further down the road is the Eiffel Tower. Then you've got the Great Pyramid of Cheops. You don't have to go to all those places. It's right here, you know, in Las Vegas. And so I contrast that. And, you know, Las Vegas has its merits, but I think it's even more important now that we're becoming so digitally interconnected to the rest of the world that we value where we are. Now for the macaroni and cheese. I want to put this in here because I think one of the greatest things we've got going on in Raleigh are things like Yellow Bread Company and Pools Diner and other things, and they actually all pay attention to the same things I'm talking about. Ashley Christensen is a genius about finding some local overlooked food like macaroni and cheese. How many of us grew up eating that? But she turns it into something really special. And that's like a little analogy of what I try to do as an architect. And there are many fine architects. They're not the ones you're going to read about in the headlines. They're not the Zaha Hadids. But there are people like Glenn Murcutt on the upper left and Tom Kundig on the right, and Brian McKay Lyons on the lower right, and Ted Flato in Texas. That's Australia, Seattle, Nova Scotia, and Texas, and they're all paying very close attention to where they live. The light's a little bad up here, but that's Marlon Brando, the Godfather, up there on the left. I want you to know that all of the things I've been showing you are not things that I did by myself. I had great people helping me. Here are some of them. And another thing that I've been able to do, and I consider this as a creative achievement, just like the house in the Bahamas, I've enabled them to start their own practices. It's a little annoying because sometimes they're doing better work than I am. but I'm actually very proud of these folks. When I started out my practice in North Carolina in 1982, I would get up at 5 in the morning and work on a house. And then when my children got up at 7, I'd take care of them. They'd go off to school and I'd go and teach at NC State. That's the time I got to work. Now I still get up at 6 in the morning, but I go swimming. That's because I've got some really good people who work with me. Jacob Burke and Tika Hicks and Susie Cash, Paul Drake, and Catherine Hoffman. And so we have all made, what I'm showing you together. Since I started with a stream, I thought I would end with a river. We have one life. We make the best of it. We get our chances. We do what we can. And I thought that'd be a good place to live, to end. Thank you.
We've got time for some questions, if anyone has questions for Frank.
The question is, how does one approach a renovation as compared to approaching a new building? Well, we're sitting in one. I think with any building, it's, a building itself is like a site. It's like a piece of landscape. And you want to look at it and think about what are its good points, what could be improved. And my goal, and I think Larry Scarpa has done that here, is to make whatever modern insertions are made in a sympathetic way, but in such a way that you can still read the old fabric. For 100 years we've been covering up our old buildings. But I think recently we've learned, rightly so, to make our interventions in a clear way that gives us a greater sense of depth or history. When you cover up an old building, it's almost like tearing down some historic sculpture. Well, we were fortunate there was no historic review committee in our neighborhood, or we couldn't have built that house. And a lot of people really got upset when we built that house. Why, I don't understand, but almost every week we would find notes in our mailbox from people saying, "I love your house, and I watched it being built." And, by far that's been the greater response, The AIA building, when it was finished, was voted the second ugliest building in Raleigh. And I told someone, well, if that hadn't been the case, I would have done something wrong. So, I think we do need to get used to looking at buildings that look different, because the needs of today are different. The way we live is different. Our energy and our use of the land and our care for the environment require us to think about buildings that are going to look different. And they're much nicer places to be. Did any modernist architects at NC State have an influence on me? They certainly did. I wasn't taught by the great modernists at NC State, the Buckminster Fullers and the Eduardo Catalanos, but I did get to know one person whose name was Harwell Hamilton Harris. And I met him when I moved back here. And I had known his work from books. And he was a great influence on me. He taught me that the greatest assets of a region are its people, not its architectural styles or its people and their stake in the future and their ideas. And so I think that's what I look to in North Carolina. He also taught me that a building is a portrait. Most of the architects that you see in the magazines today, for them, a building is an autobiography. But he taught me that a building is a portrait of your client, right? It's like painting a portrait. Well, new buildings that influenced me were things like Henry Camp Hefner's house on Granville Drive, and next door to that is Jim Fitzgibbon's house, which was, he did it for the Fadums, but he was the architect. And I learned a great deal from those. Those were very impressive. In terms of local contemporary buildings, that's harder to say. You know, if you look at almost any public building, we are so influenced by the fact that we live in this global economy, and it's as cheap to buy aluminum windows from Seattle as it is to think about something that's more local. And so, you know, architects work under extreme pressure to, you know, build things in certain ways. Air conditioning hasn't helped. You know, probably the three things that influenced architecture more than anything else in North Carolina was air conditioning and the automobile and Brown versus the Board of Education. That shaped North Carolina more than anything in the last 100 years. But it's changing. Many times it's easier to borrow from a historic style because it's going to be more accepted. Whereas to learn the principles of a historic building and apply those in something that looks different is perhaps more challenging. And I would say that's absolutely the case. Yeah. It is much easier to copy a style because people are used to it. Yeah. And for folks who want that, I'm quite happy for that to be the case. But I, for example, was married to someone who loved openness and light and the indoors and the outdoors. And so did I, and that's the kind of house we made. You know, we couldn't live in a house with little double-hung windows and curtains and, you know, small rooms. Right? So it's a choice. I did want to say one thing. It's not a question. I would say the thing that I've noticed the most in the 30 years or so that I've been back here is that when I came to Raleigh in the 1980s, it was still a fairly small town. There were 2 restaurants. And also it was very hard to be a designer or an artist here. Pretty much my students who graduated then knew that they would have to go to New York if they were going to make it, or Philadelphia, or DC, or Atlanta, because it wasn't possible in North Carolina. The big change, and I think it's a wonderful thing, is that that's no longer true. You can have a good design firm here. You can be a graphic artist. You can bake extraordinary bread and make a living here. And that's a wonderful change in 30 years.